Daniel, I want to chat about agents, the supposedly dark, murky world of agents. They get a bad rep, but you've worked with a lot of agents over your time, been involved in a lot of deals. Yeah. Is the perception close to the reality?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's always really difficult to try, and when the issue of agents gets brought up, is to try and be balanced as the truth, because what tends to be the media perception and the fans' perception of agents is an agent works with a player, makes one phone call to a chief executive, player comes in the next day and signs a deal and suddenly takes away millions and millions of pounds out of the deal. And the second type of stereotype really is that, you know, an agent rocks up with a world-class player and earns £40 million from a deal. And the truth is, all of those two specific types of examples are really quite outliers in the wider game. Simply because there are lots of agents that are incredibly hardworking, brilliantly at networking, hard negotiators, that have spent a lifetime trying to recruit good players that they believe will ultimately deliver on the pitch. But the truth is that there, just in any industry, there are lots of different characters with lots of different character traits, working and trying to find angles on any deal they possibly can. And in an industry where there is a lot of money being paid to recruit what are effectively world-class and elite players, and everyone down from that pyramid, there are always going to be opportunists that try to find particular angles on situations. So my narrative, and there's a narrative I put in the book a bit, which is to just try and give a bit of a counterbalance is the truth, because usually it will be the club that will tend to castigate the agent and or the player for unsettling the player. But the reverse is never usually the case, where, for example, the club wants to get rid of the player and is doing everything it can to try and make sure that the player leaves, that it is as smooth as possible, and that transfer out can be managed as easy as possible. So, you know, my narrative tends to be, like in any industry, there's good and bad, but especially in here, this is magnified to an even greater extent because of the huge money involved. And, you know, we look at the latest FA figures in terms of intermediary figures, and, you know, over £260 million was paid to intermediaries on Premier League transactions from the last 12 months before this summer window occurred, which is obviously a significant amount of money. But again, that's quite more nuanced, because actually what we're talking about is clubs paying agents rather than players paying agents. And I think a lot of the debate in the mainstream media would not be nullified, but wouldn't be as strong and vociferous if it was the situation where players paid their agent what they thought was the going rate, and clubs weren't effectively quite in the same transactional space generally, and that might change a little bit with the FIFA regulations that are going to be amended. But you know, that's at least my rambling start on why agents sometimes get a bad rep, sometimes duly so, other times actually it suits everybody for agents to take that route.
Yeah, so let's go through those two cases. So you said the first one, I was just an agent, or the kind of two bad case reputations, and let's go through why that isn't always the case. So first one, the agent just calls up the CEO and kind of just says, "Oh, you should sign my player." Now I can speak a little bit to that, in that the amount of detail that clubs go through now in the recruitment process, and I have to say in the last kind of 5 years or so, that's become a lot more sophisticated in terms of the use of data and really trying to understand the value of players. So the agents almost are a part of the transaction, but there's a lot more work that goes into it. But maybe you can speak more about that. And then the other one, does a Paul Pogba need an agent? Because it doesn't take anyone on the street can watch a football match and tell Paul Pogba is a good player. So does he need an agent to help him move to another club when that club probably identified them himself?
Yeah, I think the first one is both are pretty nuanced in different ways. The first really is that in order for any agent to do a deal, they need to have very strong relationships and networks with the decision makers, which isn't easy in the first place, because ultimately, for a chief executive, a technical director, chief scout, sporting director, whatever else it might be, to pick up the phone to an agent who knows that actually they know what they're talking about, they can do the deal, it's going to be done at the right price, it's going to be done in a fair way, etc. That takes usually years of trust to actually develop and maintain. And if you imagine that agent probably has to multiply that type of relationship maybe across 50, 60, 70 different clubs over, again, what might be a 20, 30 year lifespan, it becomes almost that the agent becomes a product of his own invisible, valuable network, is the truth. So even if it is just that one call, which it almost always isn't, and even if they manage to do a deal in a day, which almost always isn't the case, that ability to be able to pick up the phone, to know what that club wants, to know the range of that club wants, and to be able to, for the club to know that this person is speaking sense and something might actually constructively happen, that is not a short-term relationship as a developer.
And before you get onto the big players, I can tell you that in particular is really valuable with the smaller clubs. So we work a lot with kind of smaller teams. We work with teams in Serbia and Bulgaria and all over the place, where the information on players is difficult to glean, and so agents become a really important lubricator of the marketplace, because they're able to provide information to both the player, the selling club and the buying club around whether that player's available, what his personality's like, whether he'd be able to adapt to a new country, all those types of things that, even us, with the amount of data that we use to analyse decisions, we know that it can't always touch those bits. So agents definitely clearly have value on, that whole football economy, where it isn't about your top players. But what about the top players in that instance?
Yeah, the short answer is that unless I believe a player is staying at one club for the entirety of his career, which is pretty much, again, very rare and is the outlier, you don't really have the Jamie Carragers and the Gary Nevilles of the world now really staying around, that effectively then all you need an agent for is to be able to understand what the market dynamics are in that particular squad, and then to work out which category effectively that player should fall under, and negotiate well enough to make sure that they are effectively at a decent equilibrium level with the individuals that are at the same level in their squad. And then it's a negotiation, really. Now, can a lawyer or an accountant or a tax advisor have those type of negotiations if it is as simple as that type of transaction and deal? Quite maybe so. So I remember Roy Keane, I remember talking a while back about his lawyer effectively helping do one of his renegotiations because he knew he wasn't going to leave Man United, and actually it was a matter of a commercial negotiation with one club rather than going out into the market. So I think ultimately it's when agents really do their work is where the elite player is going out into the wider market, or a substantive part of their work, because what then that agent is having to do is use their network, which they built up over a long period of time, use that invisible information of all the information they've garnered from all of those particular individuals at particular clubs that are constantly feeding information about the type of player that they want, the type of category they're looking at, the type of price range they're looking to try and do, maybe even the type of character traits that the particular player needs to be. And then they are sorting and sifting between, even if it's just one player they're working with, but usually it's probably 20 players that they're looking to thinking of maybe having potential transfers with. And then it becomes understanding the negotiation strategy for each of those particular clubs in turn, and then thinking about the commercials. It may be, again, wages, it may be bonuses, it may be image rights, it may be signing on fees and loyalty, it may be economic rights. And that's just one negotiation with one club, never mind multiple negotiations with multiple clubs involving multiple players. So that's why that summer window can be, and winter window obviously, but the summer window being a bit longer, can obviously be a very big opportunity for agents. But more importantly, I think for the bigger agents that are working with elite players, it is almost because the stakes are so high and the transfer fees are so large and the wages can be so big that you need that combination of well-networked information symmetry mixed with negotiation and insider information effectively on what salaries are likely to be paid to those players in order to put that player in the mix for a potential transfer. Because these days, international transactions for multi-million pound deals, are complex things.
So having said all that, they're still looking, or FIFA is still looking to regulate intermediaries a bit more. Talk us through some of the regulations that have been proposed and what the implications of that might be.
Yeah, exactly. So it's a relatively recent announcement where FIFA are now looking to re-regulate what's called the intermediary space, but effectively the agent space. And some more of the more controversial measures in place are one or two things, but effectively it is to regulate the commission that is payable to agents. Now, the way that agents have relationships with clubs and players differs in different ways, but usually the way that things can work and what UEFA are effectively saying is as follows. If an agent is representing a selling club, the maximum commission that that selling club can pay to the agent is 10% of the transfer fee. If the agent is working with the player and the buying club, a dual representation contract, then the maximum commission payable can be 6%, 3% for each, effectively. Now, as you can imagine, a lot of agents associations and agents are up in arms for that because by pure comparison, no one's ever suggested that the film actors, agents should be commission capped, and in the same way with other music agents or other types of entertainment agents generally. So the query in my mind a lot of the time, and I'm sure there will be likely to be a legal case around those types of restrictions, is why are those restrictions necessary and are they objectively justifiable, really? And I think FIFA is going to have some significant questions to be asked around why those caps are at that certain levels, why they need to be there at all, and whether there's any better alternatives to be had instead of that cap.
So if you were head of that task force, what would some of your recommendations be around that space?
Well, the truth is a lot of those recommendations that will come into force are actually, I believe, actually to be applauded. So there's a whole new education process, there's an exam that will have to be taking place, there's likely to be insurance that you're going to have to need. Also, slightly wider transfer market implications are limitation to loans, which maybe we'll spend another time talking about as well, which is important really from a talent hoarding perspective, I guess, as well. And really one of the only controversial elements was whether there was going to be this cap on agents' fees. And that, I think, I was at a conference recently where FIFA were talking about this at length. Their argument was we've got to do it for a variety of different reasons. Whether everyone is completely in agreement with those reasons, it's neither here nor there, I guess, for the time being. But the question ultimately is whether that is a breach of competition law, without getting too legal and technical, and also whether that restriction is proportionate enough. So, the agents are already quite rightly so up in arms about it. From my geeky perspective, it would be great to see when those cases actually happen after the regulation has been implemented, to hear all the different submissions about actually whether the rule and the cap can be sustainable from a legal perspective.
Agents in a lot of other industries have faced disruption. So I think of like travel agents or estate agents, often through technology. Is that something you see happening? Obviously, one of the key things that's happened in those spaces is the ability for information to be passed freely between consumer to consumer or business to business. In football, as you said, the agent sits between often two parties and passes information. Do you think that might be disrupted in any way, like those other industries?
Well, it's like anything. There are certain platforms which provide clubs access to particular agents and clubs in some type of online brokering system, which I know is used across a variety of different platforms in particular countries as well. So that isn't necessarily a new phenomenon, but I think ultimately when we're talking about football, there is so much inside of football which is relationships driven, and the need for personal connectivity and contacts. I'm not saying that will suddenly go away anytime soon. But like in a lot of industries, that type of brokerage relationship where we're not necessarily talking about just a product, if that's the right way of saying it, it's a bit more nuanced than buying a house or other types of brokerage services or a financial product, for example. When we're talking about quite a unique industry like sports, and even more unique and challenging as in terms of football, I think that those agents to be able to have those relationships with clubs and players and other agents potentially is quite a dense market to break down. And so for the time being, I don't necessarily see sea change, but ultimately tech is there to be able to be used and exploited in lots of different ways. And if I may say, just on the flip side of that then, which is, the leader to your question actually was data, really, and the exponential use of data in lots of different elements inside the football industry. If I can ask the question of when agents or particular clubs approach you and ask for particular elements, what types of data or what types of input or information are they requesting from you to be able to assist with a particular job or project, from what you're able to say at least?
So I think in the recruitment space, if you're talking about almost like a war between agents and clubs and the use of data in that recruitment process, I think clubs are probably doing a bit more in that space at the moment. So clubs are increasingly getting more and more sophisticated about the data that you use in order to identify players, in order to understand their value to the team, and we do a lot of work with that as well, in terms of, you know, really trying to get to the heart of what how well players are performing and how much they're going to impact the team. You know, how many points per season is this player worth to the team, and therefore can you put a pound value on that? And I think clubs are getting better armed with that information when it comes to contract negotiations or renegotiations as well. So if a club can go to the table with objective information or independent information that says, you know, this player is worth X to the team, and this is his salary, this is what the market salary is for that band of player, then often what the agent might only have to go back with is his own word or own opinion. And increasingly what we've seen in US sports in particular is that the teams again led the way with the data revolution in terms of using data to evaluate the value of players, and then the agents had to catch up, and now you've got whole agencies that have got their own models, and you're having these case studies where you've got model offs basically between teams and agents, and like, you know, our model's saying this, your model's saying this. Well, at least we're both coming at it objectively, and you've got some ground to meet on, potentially in the middle. So I think there is scope for agents to increase their sophistication, actually get a jump start on clubs in a lot of cases. You know, not all clubs are the most sophisticated when it comes to evaluating the worth of their players. So if agents can go in and go, look, we've done this analysis on our player. It's not just me saying he's the best player ever. It's all this data, all this information that shows where he's benchmarked relative to other players, shows what he's likely to add to the team. This is how much he increases your chances of being in the Champions League or in the Europa League or staying in the division. You know, based on all that, then he is worth this. And it's not that it becomes inarguable, because data is never inarguable, but it does help anchor the conversation and help with the negotiation. So I think if we talk about disruption in agencies, I think that's potentially the one area where it could go, where actually it's almost agents potentially disrupting the clubs themselves with a new approach of looking at players.
And the one last thing I was thinking about as well, which we've talked about previously offline, is the ability for, you know, companies like yourself to actually identify talent through your data models that then those agencies can then go and look to recruit in different ways. So it's almost recruitment for the recruiters in a way, and that becomes, I think, an interesting model or product to maybe talk about too.
Yeah, absolutely. I think, again, you know, we speak about teams being potentially over and undervalued in the club transaction space because they've been lucky and unlucky. Players can be the same. There can be some players that are perhaps playing in an unattractive team or an unattractive league that are still great players that are capable of playing in top leagues, but are overlooked for all manner of reasons. So for agents to get smarter about identifying those players in the first place, and not just picking off the best academy kids at the top teams in the world, but actually thinking about, okay, well, you know, are there players in Switzerland or Austria or Poland, for example, that might not catch the eye initially of the top agents or the top teams, but actually, if given the right advice and if given the right kind of career pathway, they might be able to make it to the top. So there's plenty of undervalued players out there. And I guess, again, almost like if you're talking about teams and agents, if the agents can get to the players first before the teams, then they're a huge advantage when the teams begin to wake up to the possibilities of those undervalued players.